Hello, my name is Calder Whitman, 35 years old. I live in Houston, Texas, in a modest red brick house in the suburbs, where ancient oak trees cast their shade and the chirping of insects fills the night air. I am the deputy director of Whitman and Sons, a family-owned construction company where the word family sounds warm, but to me feels like a thorn lodged deep in my heart, aching day after day, never ceasing to hurt. I don't know where to begin this story, but perhaps I'll start with the early mornings, when I stand before the mirror trying to straighten my tie, staring into my own weary eyes and asking myself, what am I doing all of this for? I've spent my entire life trying to prove that I'm worthy of the Whitman name, worthy of recognition from my father, Charles Whitman, the patriarch of this construction empire. But the harder I try, the more I feel like an invisible man, a faint shadow in my own family. Today is a day like any other. I wake up at 5 in the morning, brew coffee in the quiet kitchen, and listen to Mila, my wife, softly humming an old song in the living room. Mila is an art teacher, a gentle and profound soul, the only person in the world who makes me feel I don't need to shout to be heard. She's painting something. Probably a vibrant, abstract piece that I'll never fully understand but always find comforting to look at. Calder, she calls, her voice as light as a breeze. Don't forget to eat breakfast. I made some toast for you. I smile, but the smile isn't strong enough to hide the heaviness in my heart. I drive to the office, passing through Houston's sun-drenched streets. Whitman and Sons is located downtown, a gleaming glass building with the company logo etched on a polished brass sign. I walk in, greet a few employees, and receive polite but cold nods in return. They know who I am, the eldest son of Charles Whitman, but their eyes always say something else. You're nothing. And I've grown used to it. So used to it that it no longer hurts as it once did, just a numbing sensation like touching an old scar. My office is on the 12th floor, a small room with a window overlooking Houston's skyline. I sit down, open my laptop, and review spreadsheets and reports. Numbers are where I find safety. I'm good with them, so good that no one in the company can do better. 3 years ago, I saved the company from potential bankruptcy when a major project in Dallas nearly collapsed due to my younger brother Ryan's mistake. But Charles never mentioned it. Not a word of thanks, not a pat on the shoulder. Instead, he called Ryan into his office, patted him on the back, and said, "Good job, son. You've learned how to handle a crisis." I stood outside the door, hearing every word, feeling as if someone had punched me square in the chest. Ryan Whitman, my younger brother, 32 years old, with blonde hair, a radiant smile, and a confidence I could never muster. He's the star of the family, the heir Charles is always proud of. Ryan doesn't need to try too hard. He just shows up, cracks a few jokes, and the world is ready to hand itself to him. And me? I work 12 hours a day, checking every number, reading every contract, ensuring no mistake slips through. But to Charles, I'm just the good accountant, a useful tool, nothing more. That day, Charles called me into the meeting room. I walked in and saw him sitting at the head of the table with Ryan beside him, grinning as if he'd just won a big poker game. "Calder, we need to discuss the Austin project. I want Ryan to lead it," my father said, his voice low and cold. I nodded, though it felt like someone had poured ice water over me. The Austin project was my idea. I had spent 3 months researching, planning, and meeting with partners. But my father didn't even glance at me when he said, "Ryan will do well. You handle the financial reports, that's your strength." I wanted to scream. I wanted to slam the table and yell in his face that I'm not just a guy who does reports, that I've sweated and stayed up countless nights to keep this company afloat. But I didn't. I just nodded, stood up, and left the room. Ryan looked at me, flashing a half smile as if he knew I was dying inside but couldn't be bothered to care. When I returned home that evening, my shoulders felt heavy, as if I were carrying a block of concrete from the office. I parked in the driveway, letting the engine run for a few seconds just to listen to its steady hum, the only sound of the day that didn't judge me. In the dim glow of the streetlights, Our red brick house looked peaceful, as if it knew nothing of the storms raging inside me. I turned off the engine, stepped out, and tried to take a deep breath, but Houston's humid air only made my chest feel tighter. Mila was waiting for me at home, with a simple but warm dinner, grilled meat and mashed potatoes, my favorite. She sat across from me, her gentle brown eyes looking straight into mine, as if she could see the invisible scars in my heart. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. I wanted to say I wasn't okay, that I was tired of proving myself, tired of being compared to Ryan, tired of feeling like I was never good enough. But I just smiled, took her hand and said, "I'm fine. Just a long day." Mila squeezed my hand, her fingers soft but strong. "You don't have to be like them to be recognized, Calder," she said, as if she knew exactly what was screaming in my head. "You're enough. To me, you're always enough." I leaned down, kissed her forehead, and in that moment I felt I could breathe again. Mila is my light, the small flame that keeps me from being swallowed by the darkness. But even she can't erase the feeling that one day all this pain will explode. And I'm afraid that when that day comes, I won't be the Calder Whitman I once knew. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, listening to Mila's steady breathing beside me. I thought about Charles, about Ryan, about the company I've devoted my life to serving. And I wondered, will there ever be a day when I escape this shadow? I don't know the answer. But I know that deep inside I'm waiting for a spark, an opportunity, something to change everything. And I had no idea that opportunity would come sooner than I thought, at the fateful gala just around the corner, the 40th anniversary celebration of Whitman and Sons. On the morning of the gala, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest, as if someone had placed a stone on my heart. Mila was already up, standing in front of the bedroom mirror, adjusting the deep green dress she had chosen for tonight. She turned around, caught my gaze, and smiled. "You look too worried," she said, stepping toward me and placing a hand on my shoulder. "It's just a party, Calder. We'll get through it." I took her hand, feeling the warmth of her slender fingers. "I'm not worried about the party," I said, though we both knew it was a lie. "It's just, I know Charles will do something. He always does." Mila didn't say anything, only squeezed my hand, as if trying to pass me some strength to face the storm that was coming. The gala was held at a luxurious hotel in downtown Houston, where crystal chandeliers sparkled like stars and vibrant red velvet curtains adorned the walls. Whitman and Sons had rented the grandest ballroom, filled with round tables draped in white silk and expensive wine glasses that infused the air with a sweet aroma. As Mila and I walked in, soft jazz music played, mingling with the lively chatter and laughter of the guests, partners, investors, senior staff, and reporters hunting for stories about my family's construction empire. I wore a black suit with a green tie to match Mila's dress. She held my arm, walking confidently, but I could feel the eyes of the crowd on us, or rather on me. A few people nodded in greeting, but most only glanced briefly, as if I were an insignificant detail in this lavish scene. Ryan, of course, was the center of attention. He stood near the bar, wearing a perfectly tailored gray suit, laughing and talking with a group of investors. Charles was by his side, patting Ryan's shoulder, his eyes gleaming with pride. My stomach churned, but I kept a smile plastered on my face, like the mask I'd worn my whole life. "Calder, are you okay?" Mila whispered, gently squeezing my arm. I nodded, but my throat felt dry. I knew what was coming. Charles had planned this gala not just to celebrate the company's 40th anniversary, but to announce something monumental. And I had a sinking feeling it would be another blow to my self-esteem. We found a table near the corner of the room where I could observe without drawing too much attention. Mila started chatting with a few guests, her voice gentle and warm, always knowing how to ease a tense atmosphere. I sipped my wine, trying to focus on its slightly bitter taste instead of the growing unease in my chest. Then the microphone crackled, cutting through the music and laughter. Charles stepped onto the stage, his black suit exuding authority, his silver hair meticulously combed. He tapped the mic lightly and smiled at the crowd. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice deep and commanding, "tonight is a special occasion. 40 years ago, Whitman and Sons was just a small dream in my garage. Today it is an empire, and I'm proud to stand here and share this success with all of you." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound crashing like a wave. I sat still, my hand gripping the wine glass tightly. Mila placed her hand on my thigh, a small gesture that reminded me she was there by my side. Charles continued, recounting the company's history, the major projects, the multi-million-dollar contracts. He mentioned Ryan, calling him the future leader, and the crowd clapped again. My blood ran hot, but I stayed still, my mask intact. Then Charles looked straight at me. My heart pounded as if it knew what was coming. "Calder," he said, his voice suddenly colder, "my eldest son is a hard worker. He's good with accounting, good with numbers. But to lead a company like Whitman and Sons, we need more than that. We need vision, we need fire. And that's why our future CEO will be Ryan." The room exploded in applause, but for me, every sound was muffled. I felt like I was falling, as if the floor beneath me had vanished, leaving me suspended in an endless void. Charles had just publicly humiliated me in front of hundreds of people, partners, colleagues, the press. He had told the world I wasn't good enough, strong enough, Whitman enough. Mila gripped my hand tightly, her nails digging into my skin, but I didn't feel the pain. I only felt emptiness. "Calder," Mila whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't listen to him, don't let him define you." But I couldn't respond. I just stared at my wine glass, trying to keep my breathing steady, trying not to let the tears spill. I wasn't crying out of sadness. I was crying out of anger, out of the helplessness that had weighed me down for 35 years. The gala continued, but I no longer heard anything. Ryan took the stage, delivering a confident thank you speech, and the crowd cheered again. I wanted to stand up to leave, but Mila held me back. "Stay," she said, her voice firm. "You don't need to run. You're stronger than this." I looked into Mila's eyes, saw the resolve in them, and knew she was right. Running would only prove Charles correct, that I wasn't strong enough, wasn't fiery enough. So I stayed, sitting up straight, though every breath felt like a dull blade cutting into my chest. The crowd kept laughing, the clink of wine glasses rang out, and the chandeliers glittered as if mocking my powerlessness. I took another sip of wine, but it only made my throat more bitter. And then, in a quiet moment amidst the noise, I sank into thought, and an image of my mother, Catherine, flashed into my mind, vivid as a painting crafted from memory. My mother was always a light in my darkest days. I remembered summer afternoons in Houston when I was 6 or 7, when she would take me to the backyard, where she tended a bed of vibrant red carnations. She'd sit on the grass, singing old folk songs, her voice clear as wind chimes. "Calder, my boy," she'd say, stroking my hair, "you have a strong heart. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." I'd lie beside her, watching clouds drift across the sky, feeling the world was peaceful, as if there were no Charles, no cold words, no dismissive looks. Once when I broke her favorite porcelain vase, I sobbed, thinking I'd be scolded. But she just laughed, pulled me into her arms, and said, "Broken things can be fixed, Calder. But your heart, you must keep it whole." I didn't fully understand her words then, but now, sitting in this gala, I realized she was trying to teach me how to face the wounds life would bring. She passed away when I was 10, and since then I've always felt like a part of me went with her. Charles rarely spoke of her, and when I asked, he'd brush it off as if she were a chapter he wanted to erase. The memory of my mother was like a small flame, both warm and painful, burning in my chest. I wondered if she were still alive, would she let Charles treat me this way? Would she stand up, take my hand, and tell the world I was worthy? I closed my eyes, trying to push away the pain, but it lingered, like a thorn lodged deep in my heart. Mila noticed the change in me. She leaned closer, whispering, "What are you thinking about?" I shook my head, not wanting to pull her into my darkness. The gala went on, but I felt like I was in another world, detached from the laughter and glittering lights. Mila still held my hand, and I knew she was trying to keep me from drifting too far. I looked around, seeing Ryan still shining among the crowd, like a star I could never match. Charles stood nearby, continuing to chat with investors, his eyes never turning toward me. Then, as the gala neared its end, a middle-aged man approached our table. He was tall, with salt and pepper hair, wearing a simple gray suit that still exuded authority. He looked at me, his gaze sharp but not hostile, as if searching for something in me. "Calder Whitman, right?" he asked, his voice low and calm. I nodded, slightly surprised. "I'm Robert Sinclair," he said, extending his hand. "An investor. I'm here at the invitation of one of your company's partners." I shook his hand, feeling its strength and warmth. "Pleased to meet you," I said, my voice polite but hollow. I wasn't in the mood for small talk, but Mila smiled and invited him to sit. Robert declined politely. He just stood there looking at me strangely, as if trying to read a book he'd long forgotten. Then he asked, his voice slow, almost a whisper, "What was your mother's name?" I froze. The question came out of nowhere, like a stone thrown into a still lake. "Why do you ask?" I replied, my tone slightly guarded. Mila looked at me, then at Robert, her eyes full of curiosity. "Just a hunch," Robert said, his gaze never leaving me. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a wallet, and took out a small yellowed photograph. He placed it on the table and slid it toward me. I leaned down and my heart seemed to stop. It was a photo of my mother, Catherine, from her younger days, with the gentle smile I could never forget. Her eyes in the photo sparkled, but they also carried a sadness I hadn't noticed as a child. "This is," I whispered. I looked up at Robert, and for the first time I saw his eyes were red, as if he were holding back something. "How do you have this photo?" I asked, feeling the world shrink until it was just me, Robert, and the faded picture on the table. Robert didn't answer immediately. He just looked at me, his eyes full of an emotion I couldn't decipher. "We need to talk, Calder," he said, his voice low like a promise. "But not here. Not tonight." I sat there, my hand still touching the faded photograph of my mother, my heart pounding as if it might burst out of my chest. The crowd around me continued to laugh and talk. The jazz music still floated through the air, but for me, everything seemed to stop. The photo in my hand, my mother Catherine's gentle smile, her eyes both warm and sorrowful, was like a door leading me back to old days while simultaneously opening up a secret I had never dared to imagine. Robert Sinclair, this stranger, knew my mother. More than that, he looked at me as if I were a part of him, a long-lost piece of a puzzle. Mila placed her hand on my shoulder, pulling me back to reality. "Calder, are you okay?" she whispered, her gaze shifting from me to Robert, filled with curiosity and concern. I nodded, but my throat was dry, unable to form words. Robert gave a faint smile, one that carried both tenderness and pain. "You have my number," he said, handing me a business card. "Call me when you're ready." Then he turned and blended into the crowd, as if he were just another guest at this lavish gala. I clutched the business card, feeling the sharp edges dig into my palm. Mila looked at me, not asking anything further, but I knew she was waiting for me to speak. "Let's go home," I said, my voice hoarse. She nodded, stood up, and we left the gala, leaving behind the chandeliers and the murmurs of the crowd. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the living room, the dim yellow light casting shadows on the photo of my mother I kept in a drawer. Mila had gone to bed, but I knew she was still awake, listening to my every movement from the bedroom. The photo of my mother, alongside the one Robert had given me, lay side by side on the table. Both were of her, but Robert's was older. Its edges yellowed as if it had been cherished through decades. I stared into my mother's eyes, searching for a clue, an answer. Why did Robert have this photo? Who was he to her? And why, when he looked at me, did I feel a strange connection, as if I were seeing another version of myself? The next morning I called Robert, I didn't know what I expected, but I couldn't let this question hang in the air. He arranged to meet me at a small coffee shop on the outskirts of Houston, a quiet place with wooden walls and the rich aroma of roasted coffee. When I arrived, Robert was already there, sitting with a cup of black coffee, his expression pensive but lighting up when he saw me walk in. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing for me to sit. I nodded, placing my mother's photo on the table as a way to start the conversation. "Tell me," I said, my voice harder than I intended. "How do you have this photo? How did you know my mother?" Robert took a deep breath, as if bracing himself for something heavy. Then he began to speak, his voice low and deliberate, as if each word was carefully chosen. "I met Catherine when we were both very young," he said. "We grew up in a small town not far from Houston. I was a poor kid working at a gas station to get by. Catherine, she was a light. She had a smile that could melt anything, and her heart was bigger than the Texas sky." I listened, feeling as if I were stepping into a story I only knew half of. Robert recounted how he and my mother had fallen in love, a fierce but troubled love. Her family, especially my grandfather, didn't approve of him. "They wanted her to marry someone with status, with money," Robert said, his eyes darkening. "And then Charles Whitman came along. He was the son of a wealthy family, the perfect heir. Catherine's family pressured her to marry him. I had nothing to hold her back with except love. But love sometimes isn't enough." My heart tightened. I thought of my mother, of the sad smile in the photo, of the way she always looked at me as if she wanted to say something but never did. "So you left?" I asked, my voice trembling, unsure if it was from anger or pain. Robert nodded, his eyes filled with regret. "I had no choice. I left Texas, started over. I built Sinclair Energy from nothing, became a man I thought Catherine would be proud of. But I never forgot her. And when I saw you at the gala, I knew immediately. You have your mother's eyes, Calder, and her kind heart too." I shook my head, not wanting to believe it. "What are you saying?" I asked, though deep down I was beginning to sense the truth. Robert looked straight at me, his voice trembling but resolute. "Calder, I think I might be your father." His words hit me like a punch. I felt the blood rush to my head, my ears ringing. "That's impossible," I said, my voice breaking. "Charles is my father. He—" But I stopped. Charles had never treated me like a father would. He always saw me as a burden, someone not good enough to carry the Whitman name. And my mother. She always looked at me with a sadness I never understood. Could it be because she knew the truth? "I don't expect you to believe me right away," Robert said, his voice softening. "But I want you to know the truth. We can do a DNA test if you want." I looked at him, searching for any sign of deceit, but all I saw was a man trying to mend a wound that had festered for decades. I nodded, saying nothing more. "Okay," I said finally. "I want to know the truth." The days that followed were an emotional whirlwind. Robert and I met a few more times, always in discreet places, a quiet park, a small diner on the outskirts of town. Each time he shared more about my mother, about their time together, about the dreams they once shared. I began to see her not just as the gentle woman in my memories, but as someone who had sacrificed her happiness under family pressure. I felt anger at my grandfather, at Charles, and even at myself for not noticing the signs sooner. Finally, the day of the DNA test arrived. I stood in the lab, my hands trembling as I gave my blood sample. Robert stood beside me, silent but with hope in his eyes. The results came back after 3 days, and I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Mila sat beside me, holding my hand, saying nothing but her presence enough to keep me from falling apart. The result? 99.9% match. Robert Sinclair was my father. I looked up at Robert, seeing his eyes red with emotion. He didn't say anything, just stepped forward and hugged me. For the first time in my life, I felt a father's embrace, not the coldness of Charles, not the perfunctory gesture of a man who saw me as a tool. "I've lost too many years," Robert whispered, his voice choked. "But I don't want to lose my son again." I didn't cry. Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know how to feel. I had lived 35 years under the Whitman name, enduring Charles's disdain, trying to prove I was worthy. And now, I discovered I wasn't part of that family. I was the son of Robert Sinclair, a man I had just met but who carried a love I had never received from Charles. When I returned home the evening after receiving the DNA test results, my hands were still trembling. The envelope with the results tucked inside my jacket pocket like a heavy secret. Mila was in the kitchen. She looked up as I walked in, her bright smile fading quickly when she saw my expression. "Calder?" she called, setting down the knife and stepping closer to me. "What's wrong? Do you have the results?" I nodded, unable to speak right away. I pulled her to the sofa, took out the envelope, and placed it on the table. "Mila," I began, my voice hoarse, as if each word had to fight its way out. "Charles isn't my father. Robert Sinclair. He's my real father. The DNA test confirmed it. 99.9% match." Mila's eyes widened, her breath catching. "Oh my God, Calder," she whispered, covering her mouth with her hand. "You mean, all these years Charles wasn't—" She trailed off as if trying to process the truth. Then she grabbed my hand, her fingers gripping tightly, her eyes filled with emotion. "How do you feel? I mean, this is huge." I shook my head, feeling like a storm was raging in my chest. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'm angry. Angry at Charles for treating me like I was expendable. Angry at Mom for never telling me the truth. But at the same time, I feel relieved, Mila. Like I've found a piece of myself I didn't know I'd lost." In the days following the DNA results, I was like a ghost. I still went to work, still reviewed spreadsheets and financial reports at Whitman and Sons, but my mind was elsewhere. I thought about Robert, about my mother, about the stories he'd shared. Sinclair Energy, the company he mentioned, kept lingering in my thoughts. I knew it was an oil and gas company, but I had never really looked into it. One evening, while Mila was painting in the living room, I sat at my computer quietly researching Sinclair Energy. What I found left me stunned. Sinclair Energy wasn't just an ordinary oil company. It was one of the largest conglomerates in Texas, with projects spanning from oil extraction to renewable energy. The press called Robert Sinclair a self-made billionaire, a man who started from nothing and now owned a fortune worth billions. I read articles about him, about how he overcame poverty, about the bold deals that propelled Sinclair Energy to the top. One article described him as a man who never gives up, and I felt a strange connection, as if I were seeing a part of myself, a part I'd never been allowed to explore. I closed the laptop, feeling like I'd opened a door I wasn't sure I wanted to step through. Mila noticed my silence. She set down her paintbrush, walked over, and sat beside me on the sofa. "Did you find something?" she asked, her voice gentle but curious. I took a deep breath, trying to sort through my tangled thoughts. "Robert Sinclair," I began, my voice slightly shaky. "He's not just some investor, Mila, he's a billionaire. Sinclair Energy. His company is several times larger than Whitman and Sons. He built it from nothing, without a wealthy family or any backing." Mila's eyes widened, her eyebrows rising in surprise. "A billionaire?" she repeated as if she couldn't believe her ears. "You mean, that man, your real father, is a self-made billionaire?" She leaned toward me, her eyes sparkling. "Calder, do you realize how big this is? He's not just your father. He's someone who's done extraordinary things." I nodded, but my heart felt heavy. "I know," I said, my voice lowering. "But it also scares me. If he's really my father, why didn't Mom ever say anything? Why did she let me grow up with Charles with all that disdain?" Mila took my hand, her fingers intertwining tightly with mine. "Maybe your mom didn't have a choice," she said, her voice soft but firm. "But now you have a chance, Calder. A chance to understand her, to understand yourself. And if Robert is your father, then you carry a part of him. His strength, his resilience. You don't need to be a Whitman to prove that." I looked at her, feeling a small spark flicker in the darkness. Mila always knew how to make me feel worthy, even when I doubted myself. But the truth about Robert, about Sinclair Energy, still weighed on me like a stone on my chest. I wasn't just facing a new father, but an entirely different world. One where I could be part of something greater, but also one filled with risks and mysteries. I started meeting Robert more regularly, but always kept it secret from the Whitmans. I didn't want Charles or Ryan to know anything, not because I was afraid, but because I wasn't ready to confront them. Each time I met Robert, I learned another piece of my mother's story, about the years she lived quietly, trapped between family pressures and her own heart. Robert told me about the nights they spent by the river, dreaming of a free future only to be torn apart by harsh reality. "Catherine wanted to protect you," he said during one meeting, his eyes red. "She didn't want you to grow up in poverty like I did. But I think she didn't expect Charles to treat you the way he did." Robert's stories left me both heartbroken and angry. I was angry at my grandfather for forcing my mother to marry Charles. I was angry at Charles for turning me into a shadow in my own family. And I was angry at myself for not seeing the truth sooner. But above all, I felt a longing to understand my mother, to understand Robert, and to find myself. A few days later, I met Robert again at the small coffee shop on the outskirts of Houston, where we had become regulars. He sat there, a cup of black coffee in front of him, his eyes both gentle and resolute. "I've been thinking a lot about you, Calder," he said, his voice low. "About what you've been through, about what Catherine wanted for you. I don't want to pressure you, but if you're ready, I want you to be a part of Sinclair Energy. Not because you're my son, but because I believe you have the potential to do great things." I looked at him, feeling a mix of doubt and excitement. "I don't know anything about oil and gas," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I only know about construction, about numbers, about keeping Whitman and Sons from collapsing." Robert smiled, a confident smile. "Numbers are the universal language of every industry, Calder. And I've seen how you work. You're meticulous, you're smart, and you don't give up. That's what I need. Start as a regional finance director. You'll learn, and I'll be by your side." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to seize this opportunity to prove I was more than just Charles's accountant. But another part was afraid. Afraid I would fail, afraid I wasn't worthy of Robert's trust. Then I thought of Mila, of my mother, of the years I'd spent living in the shadow of the Whitman family. "Okay," I said finally. "I'll try." I began working at Sinclair Energy under the title of Regional Finance Director, a role that sounded modest but was in truth a gateway to Robert's world. I kept it a secret from the Whitmans, telling Charles I was taking on an outside consulting project to broaden my experience. He merely nodded, uninterested as usual. Ryan was too busy basking in praise from partners to notice. Their indifference only fueled my determination. I wanted to prove I didn't need their validation to succeed. Working at Sinclair Energy was an entirely different world. If Whitman and Sons was an outdated machine riddled with favoritism and internal politics, Sinclair Energy was a modern organization where competence trumped lineage. I started with self-doubt, but Robert didn't treat me like a novice. He gave me real responsibilities, analyzing finances for new projects, assessing risks for investment deals, and even joining negotiations with international partners. Each day was a challenge, but also an opportunity to learn, to prove I could do more than what Charles had ever credited me for. After about 6 months of juggling my role as a finance director for both companies, I finally made my decision. I would resign from Whitman and Sons. I wrote a resignation letter, simple, concise, with no unnecessary explanations. I brought the letter to Charles' office, my heart pounding, not out of fear but from a growing sense of liberation. He was seated behind his desk, reviewing a report, barely glancing up as I entered. "What's this, Calder?" he asked, his voice cold, as if I were just an insignificant employee. "My resignation letter," I said, placing it on his desk. "I'm leaving the company in 2 weeks." Charles frowned, finally looking at me, but his eyes held no surprise or regret. "Resigning?" he repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. "What do you think you'll do out there, Calder? You're only good with numbers, but you lack vision. Without my support, you'll fail in no time." I stood there listening to the familiar words he'd used to crush me for 35 years, but this time they didn't hurt. I only felt pity for a man too blind to see anyone's worth beyond Ryan. "Thanks for letting me know," I said, my voice calm. "But I think I'll find my own way." I turned and walked out, not waiting for his response. As the office door closed behind me, I felt as if I'd shed a burden I'd carried my entire life. Charles didn't know, and I had no intention of telling him that I'd found my place, Sinclair Energy, and more importantly, a real father. He also didn't know that my decision to leave wasn't just about walking away. It was the start of a bigger plan, one that would make him and Ryan face the consequences of years of belittling me. Over the next 2 years, I poured my heart and soul into Sinclair Energy. From my role as regional finance director, I quickly proved myself through sharp analyses and bold strategies. Robert wasn't just a father, he was a mentor, teaching me to see beyond numbers, to seize opportunities in seemingly impossible situations. I worked tirelessly, from long meetings to international business trips, and gradually I became more than just an employee. I became indispensable to the company. After a major project with a Norwegian energy conglomerate, where I successfully negotiated a contract worth hundreds of millions of dollars, Robert called me into his office. "Calder," he said, his eyes filled with pride, "you've proven you're not just my son. You're a leader. I want you to take on the role of Vice President of Strategic Development. You'll help shape the future of Sinclair Energy." I was stunned. Vice President of Strategic Development, a role that demanded not just financial acumen, but vision, creativity, and leadership. I looked at Robert, searching for words, but could only nod. "Thank you," I said, my voice hoarse. "I won't let you down." Robert smiled and patted my shoulder. "You've never let me down, Calder. You remind me of Catherine. She always believed you'd achieve great things." My life, after decades, had never been brighter. It shone even more brilliantly one day when Robert called me into his office. He sat there in front of a screen displaying stock charts, his eyes sharper than usual. "Calder," he said, his voice low but laden with meaning, "Whitman and Sons is in trouble. Their stock is at its lowest in 10 years. Ryan has made mistakes, risky contracts, sloppy management. Charles is trying to cover it up, but the shareholders are losing faith. This is our chance." I frowned, my heart racing. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I had an inkling of what he was suggesting. "We can buy up Whitman and Sons shares," Robert said, sliding a folder toward me. 38% of the shares are being offered through intermediaries. If we act fast, we can control a significant portion of the company without anyone knowing until we're ready. The idea sent a jolt through me. Buying up Whitman and Sons shares wasn't just a financial move, it was a chance to reclaim what Charles and Ryan had taken from me. My self-respect, my recognition, and the years I'd lived in their shadow. But I also felt a flicker of fear. This was a massive gamble. Robert and I set the plan in motion. Acquiring Whitman and Sons shares was not a challenge for Sinclair Energy. We had ample capital, always ready for restructuring deals like this. During the analysis and investigation of Whitman and Sons, I uncovered that Ryan had made a series of serious financial missteps, signing high-risk contracts, hiding losses by manipulating reserve funds. These violations were enough to shake shareholder confidence if exposed. I saved every piece of evidence, every number, every email, like bullets waiting for the right moment to be fired. The day of the extraordinary shareholders' meeting arrived, and I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss. Robert and I were prepared, holding 38% of the shares, enough to shift the balance of power. Mila hugged me before I left the house, whispering, "Today is your day, Calder. Show them who you are." The meeting took place in Whitman and Sons' largest conference room with sunlight streaming through the glass windows, illuminating the company logo on the wall. Charles sat at the head of the table as authoritative as ever. Ryan was beside him, confident as if unaware that the company was teetering. The shareholders murmured, not expecting that today would change everything. I walked in, Robert by my side. Charles frowned when he saw us. "Calder, what are you doing here with Mr. Sinclair?" he asked, his voice icy. I sat down, for the first time not at the corner of the table but across from Charles, on the other side. Robert sat beside me, his gaze calm but razor-sharp. I took a deep breath, opened my folder, and began. "Dear shareholders," I said, my voice clear despite my pounding heart. "I represent Sinclair Energy. We currently hold 38% of Whitman and Sons shares. We propose a restructuring of the company, starting with a review of its current leadership." The room fell silent, then erupted in whispers. Charles slammed the table, his face red with fury. "Who do you think you are to do this?" he roared. "You're a nobody, Calder. You walked away and now you dare come back to destroy this family?" I slid the folder toward the shareholders, containing evidence of Ryan's financial misconduct, failed contracts, hidden losses, manipulated data in emails. "This is what's been happening under Ryan's leadership," I said, my voice sharp and cold. "Whitman and Sons cannot continue like this." Ryan's face paled and he tried to protest, but the shareholders were already flipping through the documents, whispering heatedly. Charles stood, pointing at me. "You're betraying this family," he shouted. Robert stood, his voice low but resonant. "Calder isn't betraying the family," he said, his eyes locked on Charles. "He's my son, and I won't let him be disrespected any longer." The conference room seemed to freeze. The murmurs of the shareholders stopped, leaving only a heavy silence hanging over the room. Charles looked at Robert, then at me, his face shifting from flushed red to ghostly pale, as if the blood had been drained from him. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Ryan, sitting beside him, gripped the armrests of his chair, his eyes wide, staring at me as if I had transformed into a complete stranger. "What?" Ryan stammered, his voice trembling, the usual confidence he exuded evaporating for the first time. "Calder, what are you saying? He's your father?" I didn't answer immediately. I just looked straight into Charles' eyes, seeing the confusion and anger swirling in his gaze. He had spent his entire life belittling me, calling me insignificant, but now this truth was like a slap across his face. "Impossible!" Charles finally roared, his voice breaking with shock. "Catherine would never, she couldn't." But he stopped, as if memories of my mother, of secrets he might have suspected but never confronted, were rising in his mind. "Catherine never told you, did she?" Robert interjected, his voice calm but sharp as a blade. "She sacrificed her happiness to protect Calder, to give him the life you promised her. But what did you do? You treated my son like a tool, like he was worthless." Charles recoiled, as if Robert's words were a physical blow. I saw his eyes redden, not from remorse but from the devastating hit to his ego. Ryan, his face ashen, stood abruptly, pointing at me. "You planned this, didn't you?" he spat, his voice laced with clear hatred. "You left the company, you conspired with this man to destroy us. You're a traitor." I smiled, not out of triumph, but because I realized Ryan no longer had the power to hurt me. "I'm not a traitor, Ryan," I said, my voice steady. "I'm just taking back what's mine, the self-respect you and Charles stole from me." Before Charles or Ryan could say more, an elderly shareholder, Mr. Henderson, stood up, his voice stern. "Enough," he said, looking at Charles and Ryan. "The evidence Calder has provided shows gross mismanagement and serious financial misconduct. The board cannot continue to place its trust in you both. I propose an immediate vote to remove Charles and Ryan from their leadership positions." The room erupted in whispers. Charles shouted, trying to object, but the shareholders were already flipping through the documents, reading the irrefutable evidence of Ryan's failures. The vote happened quickly, and with our 38% stake combined with the support of other shareholders, Charles and Ryan were removed from their roles. Charles stood there, gripping the table as if unable to believe what had just happened. Ryan slumped back into his chair, his head bowed, no trace of his former arrogance remaining. I looked at them, not feeling the joy I had once imagined. Instead, I felt relief, as if a door had closed on years of pain. Robert placed a hand on my shoulder, whispering, "You did it, Calder." I nodded, knowing this wasn't the end, but the beginning of a new chapter. The conference room gradually fell quiet, with only the faint murmurs of shareholders and the sound of Charles's footsteps as he left. He didn't look at me, didn't say another word, but I saw his shoulders slump, as if the world he had built had crumbled in an instant. Ryan, his head bowed, was led out by an assistant, his eyes still flickering with anger but stripped of the arrogance he once carried. The board, after voting to remove Charles and Ryan, began discussing the future of Whitman and Sons. I sat there, still clutching the folder of documents, feeling as if I had just walked through a storm I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Mr. Henderson, the elderly shareholder, stood up again. "Calder," he said, his voice deep and authoritative, "you've shown us the misconduct we failed to see. You've proven your capability not just through numbers, but through determination and vision. I propose that you take on the role of interim CEO to guide the company through this transition." I froze, my heart pounding. CEO of Whitman and Sons, a position I had once dreamed of but never thought I'd achieve, not because I wasn't capable, but because Charles had always said I wasn't worthy. I looked at Robert, who gave a slight nod, his eyes filled with pride. "You can do this, Calder," he said, his voice low but certain. I stood, taking a deep breath. "I accept," I said, my voice ringing clear in the silent room. The shareholders applauded, not the roaring applause they once gave Ryan, but a sincere acknowledgement. For the first time, I felt I was no longer just a shadow, but someone with a voice. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Charles officially withdrew from the company without a word of goodbye. I heard he had moved to a secluded villa in the suburbs, living in isolation, as if unwilling to face the world after his downfall. Ryan faced a financial investigation from shareholders and regulators, his misconduct now exposed to the light. Part of me wanted to feel triumphant, but I couldn't. They were no longer my concern. I had surpassed them, not by tearing them down, but by standing up and becoming the best version of myself. As CEO, I began restructuring Whitman and Sons. I applied what I had learned from Sinclair Energy: transparency, efficiency, and respect for competence. I let go of those blindly loyal to Charles, replacing them with truly capable employees. I signed new contracts, expanded projects, and gradually the company began to regain its momentum. The shareholders, initially skeptical, started to trust me. But I knew that to truly move forward, I needed to sever the final tie binding me to the past. One morning, I went to a lawyer's office carrying a set of documents. I sat down, signed the papers, and officially changed my last name from Whitman to Sinclair. It wasn't just a name, it was a declaration. I was no longer Charles Whitman's son, no longer a shadow in that toxic family. I was Calder Sinclair, son of Robert Sinclair and Catherine, heir to a legacy built not on oppression but on love and perseverance. When I signed my new name for the first time, I felt as if I had shed an old skin, revealing the real person I had buried for years. I didn't need to be like Charles or Ryan to be recognized. I just needed to be myself. And that is the story of my life, a story of pain, secrets, and the journey to reclaim myself. I lived 35 years in the shadow of a family that wasn't truly mine, enduring disdain and belittlement. But I learned that the truth, no matter how hidden, can never be erased. It's always there, waiting to be discovered, waiting to be embraced. To anyone feeling trapped in a toxic family and expectations that don't belong to them, you don't have to belong to them just because they gave you life. Family isn't just blood. It's the people who love and believe in you, who see your true worth. For me, that's Mila, that's Robert, those who gave me the strength to stand up. And if you've ever thought of revenge, know that it doesn't have to be bloody. Sometimes revenge is freedom, Freedom to live, to love, to succeed in your own way without needing the approval of those who hurt you. I found that freedom not by destroying Charles or Ryan, but by building a life I'm proud of, a life my mother, Catherine, would smile upon. Walk your own path. Find the people who believe in you. And remember, no matter how painful the past, you always have the power to write a new chapter.